So I've been using the Ricoh GR IIIx for quite a while now, and I bring it pretty much everywhere with me, inside my pocket. And there's a lot that I like about this camera, as well as many of the struggles that I've been having with this camera. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. I guess you can't really have the best of like everything. So right out of the bat, this is a very small camera and it turns on very quickly in 0.8 seconds, and there's no lens cap, so all I have to do is turn it on and point and then shoot. That's pretty much it. It's perfect for street photography, and I love everything about that, except that because there's no lens cap, or because of the design of this camera, it's really easy to get dust inside the elements, like around my lens and just everything inside. And that makes it kind of like a double-edged sword here, where I like how it's pocketable and there's no lens cap, but at the same time, it's like a dust vacuum machine. I'm not gonna lie, it's terrifying by just looking at it. Now, seems like there are different ways to prevent this from happening, and one of them is to add like a lens converter. But either way, we're adding like bulk to this camera, which is something that I don't want to do, because once I add something in front of this, it's hard to put it back inside my pocket. I mean, I guess I can squeeze it, but you'll see a bulk to it, which is not very appealing. So as of now, I just don't want to think too much about this. Instead, I want to really focus on time that I get to spend with this camera before the dust starts to cause problems. Hey, you never know, maybe it won't cause any problems. As for the ergonomics and handling of this camera, it's quite well, better than I expected. I've always thought that I would get a thumb rest, or maybe like an extension down here so I can have more grips down in my hands, like with my pinky. But I guess I've gotten used to the handling of this camera to the point where I don't feel uncomfortable without a thumb rest. I can still able to access to all the dials and buttons when I'm out shooting. Speaking of which, there's no EVF on this camera, and that's not exactly a big problem for me. But the LCD screen is not exactly the best when it comes to like framing your shots and everything, especially when the battery is not exactly good on this camera. So if I do want to see my shot, I really have to bump up the brightness of the LCD screen, which is the last thing I want, because the battery is not exactly good on this camera, which we'll get into in just a bit here. Ricoh does have this viewfinder where you can put on top of this horseshoe mount, but still, it's not a EVF. But honestly, the more I shoot with this camera, the more I realize how much I actually like to use the LCD screen, especially for street photography. Like, if I use like an EVF or any of the viewfinder, I'll have to put my head like with the camera. And if I'm framing something, most likely I'll move in like this. And it feels kind of weird at the same time if I have to get close to someone, and then like just imagine my head and my camera is really close to them. I mean, I'll bet that this is a 40mm, so it's not as bad in this kind of situation, but still. So instead, I actually find the LCD screen very useful. Like, I can just extend my arm out wherever I want and take photos. I do wish that there's a football screen so I can shoot at all different kinds of angles, but I mean, if it keeps the profile down a bit, then I'll take this. That's no problem. Another plus I found when using the LCD screen to frame my shots and take photos is that I can actually see the environment in a grand scheme of things. I'm not just like tunnel vision into my viewfinder or the EVF. Instead, with the screen, I can really see who's coming in or out of the frame, like right away in front of me. And I find that very useful. One thing I noticed about the screen is that during playback, once in a while you'll see this weird halo or pattern in your photos, but it's actually not your actual photo. It just displays them like in a weird kind of way. And hopefully in the future update of the Ricoh GR series, they'll address this. But it's really not a big deal because chimping is not exactly ideal for this camera anyways. The Ricoh GR IIIx has the same exact battery from the Ricoh GR III. So there's really no expectations here. You'll get roughly around like 200 shots per battery. But the longer I use this camera, the more I'm adapt to it. So instead of leaving the camera on, I turn it off almost immediately after every shot, whenever I know there's no more shot that I might take on the street. And by just doing that, I was able to get almost 400 shots per battery before it dies, which is not too bad in my opinion. There's one major gripe I have with the battery, and that is the indicator. It only has 3 bars, which is not very predictable, and it could mean anything, really. It's probably something they could fix with a firmware update, but somehow they just haven't yet. However, I do like to charge the battery with USB-C because like if I use up all my batteries, I can still charge this camera with a power bank. Shooting with the 40mm focal length is really fun, simple, and easy. Sometimes a bit too easy, but it's really great for all kinds of photography. I do enjoy using the 40mm outdoor a lot. I can step back and retain more context whenever I want. And if I want to focus on the subject instead, I can do that too by just stepping forward. And this works most of the time because I don't live in the cities. And naturally, indoor is where it gets tricky because usually I don't have enough room because it's a more confined space. With that being said, that's usually when I pull my phone out of my pocket to capture the moment because it has a wider lens, so it gets more context and details inside the frame. So whenever I come back to this photo, I can relive this moment. And honestly, there's definitely a huge part of me wishing that I had the 28mm, the Ricoh GR IIIx inside my pocket whenever I reach for my phone. But either way, the image quality on this camera is great. I really like how the natural colors that comes out of this camera and how sharp the photos are. The colors are clean and unique in its way, and the way it renders bokeh in the background looks amazing as well. And by the way, I like the colors so much to the point where I made a recipe to shoot JPEG only photos, both in color and black and white. So feel free to check out that video if you're interested in straight out of the camera JPEG photos from Ricoh. I think they look great. As for the snap focus on the Ricoh GR IIIx, it's not as easy to use as the Ricoh GR III, but that's expected because the 28mm is a wider lens, so naturally you'll get more depth of field with the same aperture. But once you're used to the distance you're shooting, it's not too bad at all. I still use it a lot and it's very fast and reliable as well. Snap focus is also a great tool to have, especially if you're shooting in like a low light or backlit environment where the autofocus just doesn't really work very well. And by using snap focus in this situation, you don't have to rely on your camera to get sharp photos. And that is a great advantage in my opinion. And personally, I feel like the 40mm is very beginner friendly to start with, especially for street photography because you don't have to get as close to your subject on the street. And plus, the form factor of this camera is just so small to the point where people just won't take you seriously. You look like a tourist with a compact point and shoot. Most people won't get offended if you're taking photos with them like heads on like this. And like I mentioned earlier, it is a little bit harder to use snap focus using the 40 compared to the 28. But the autofocus on this camera is phenomenal, except the face and detection department. But other than that, it's great for street photography. It's plenty enough. Like if I were to start street photography all over again, this would be the camera I pick up. So despite all of the gripes I have with this camera, I still use it every day and definitely would recommend this camera to any of my friends who wants to start street photography. What about you? Do you have any gripes about this camera? Leave a comment down below if you do. And if you're interested in the settings and JPEG recipe I use with the Ricoh GR IIIx, definitely check out this video. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.